Dr. Mark Jangizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about a new idea that I've been working on for the last 6-8 months and sort of off and on for the last 10-15 years. An idea for helping the blind see and using music to help them do that. Now, this is going to be a longer video than usual, and I've written a LooFWIRED, LooFWIRED.com piece on it, and you can go there and read it a little bit more carefully. They're called "Can Music Let Blind People See?" And I go through it slowly, but I wanted to bring it over to the Rumble and YouTube and TikTok and other kinds of audiences and sort of walk through it, this LooFWIRED piece. A little bit more slowly, potentially, to help folks understand how it could potentially be helpful for the blind. Now, this is a theoretical idea. I haven't built, to actually build such a device would be another whole endeavor. But I want to motivate. I work with certain kinds of big companies here and there in the automotive and music industry and various places. I want to motivate certain folks that might be interested in working with me on such an idea. I think it could be really a big help to the blind. Now, before I start, I've written a book in the past called Harnessed: How Language and Music Mimicked Nature and Transformed Ape to Man. And the story about why we came to have music, the story of this book, this older research of mine from 2011, the book came out, is that music culturally evolved to sound like something we're already good at processing. It evolved culturally to sound like a human evocatively moving in your midst. And the book, half of the book, more than half of the book of that book is about making that kind of case, showing that there's all of these peculiar signature features to music that are sort of invariant across music. And you find exactly those strange, peculiar signatures in the sounds of human gaits and human rhythm and the nature in which we turn and the nature of the Doppler shifts that we actually make and the loudness modulations that we make. All the kinds of peculiar sounds that humans make when they're moving in your midst are also found exactly in music. That's why music is so evocative. So evocative. It's so evocative because it's not about math or Plato's realm. No, it's about the evocative stuff in human lives. Right? So it harnesses our human movement recognition systems, just as writing, another discovery of mine, writing culturally evolved to look like the contour conglomerations that happen in natural scenes. Letters evolved to look like nature, to harness our visual object recognition system and to turn it into a reading system. Speech culturally evolved to sound like solid object events, harnessing our natural ability to process and recognize solid object events and turning that solid object event recognition system into a speech recognition system. And the idea, extending that into the realm of music, is that music again, was a more aesthetic side or a more evocative and emotional side, sounding like human movers. So this, what I'm going to describe to you in terms of helping the blind see, quote unquote see, is in this vein of trying to understand music in the context of what is culturally evolved to sound like. Now, let me give you a little bit of a kind of higher philosophical motivation for how I tend to think about augmenting perception in folks. I don't know if you've seen some of these cars. Some of these cars now will have a picture of the car that you're sitting in front of you on the dashboard. And it's an overhead view, like a bird's eye view of the car. And so then it'll show other cars going around to the left, from the right or the left, and you can see things that are close to your own vehicle. And you could argue that that's useful, but it's incredibly not at all the way that evolution designs things for us. It's when things work well, it's because the perceptions are embedded around you, not seeing yourself in a third person perspective from space or from a bird above. That's not how it works. What you want is to build perceptions of some new kind of thing that you're trying to create, so that when it's over there and doing this kind of thing, it's harnessing parts of your brain that are feeling like they're over there and have the natural things that should be over there, rather than some abstract platonic representation of it that doesn't actually harness your normal capabilities. One of the things that you need to see the world is not just where things are, right? I need to know some things are in this part of my visual field, this part of my projective field. They can be behind me, I don't see them, but things are there and there. All the directions from which you can point. There's all these things in your environment at various directions from you, and vision is very good at that in the parts of your visual field that you can see. And with auditory perception, we can reasonably well, not as great as vision, but we can reasonably well tell in which directions things are around us. But another thing that we can do with vision is we're really good at sensing the direction that they're moving relative to us. We have a velocity sensitive, or motion sensitive neurons in our brain. So if it's coming directly toward me versus coming away, even instantaneously, we can often perceive that it has a particular velocity relative to us. And that's key in understanding it's not that I'm seeing it and then seeing it again like two photographs and inferring its motion. No, I'm seeing the motion instantaneously, right? It's its own separate perception, independent of where it is around you. In fact, there are illusions where you can perceive motion and yet the objects never in fact change their position. These are kinds of illusions that have this kind of property to them. These are separate kinds of fundamental primitive perceptions that we have. So if you want to give music or auditory things to the blind that lets them see, well, then in addition to letting them know that something's over there and in various places around them, you also need to let them know the directions that those objects are moving, and it should feel fundamental and fast for them to perceive. That's one intuition I want to put out there starting. We want to provide auditory stimuli that's not just, let's say you're wearing a helmet or some kind of band that says, okay, something's over there, in various different kinds of places around you. That's helpful, but you also want it to immediately inform the listener of the direction the thing is moving. And that should feel very fundamental. So what might how might one do that? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through 8 things that such a thing would have to do. Now, first thing I'm going to do, actually, even before I get to these 8 things, let me first describe what space you need to show the blind people, or that you need to have the blind folks respond to. You need to have them perceive the directions of objects around them. And so what is the space of all possible directions of objects around you? So in this first diagram here, in this sort of figure 1 on the left, imagine that there's a person sitting here where this ear circle is, and there's some object in the world that happens to be moving like that with that particular angle. That's the angle at which it's moving from that particular position. So in this case, if you imagine that the person is facing forward, where this ear was, then it's going to be off out in front to the left. But that's not key here. That could just be done by some sounds over in this part of my projective field. Key is, how do you tell the listener that it's moving in this particular direction, that it's sort of about to whiz by me? How do you do that? So that's just one specific case, but the space of all directions of movement around me is this space shown here. So that particular moving object, which had that theta angle, would be by this particular vector shown. And of course, we could turn that vector to all of these other spots in this space that go from negative 180 to a positive 180 degrees. And so that's just the whole space. The space is effectively a circle in this way. Those are all the possible directions something could pass. You could come directly toward you, they could go directly away from you, and they can go to the left, and they can go right, and all things in between. Right? That's all that means. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through 8 features of what we need our auditory stimulus to do in order to work as something that can represent the directions of movement of objects around you. Okay? That is, I'm going to say, hey, look, whatever this thing is, and I'm going to say that certain kinds of music can do this, whatever this kind of auditory stimulus is, it's got to satisfy this, to do this. All right, so let's walk through that. And when we're done, I'm going to say, well, it turns out that music with chords and chord progressions is exactly what you need to satisfy these requirements. So let's walk through the requirements really quickly here. Number 1, distinguishable. There must be distinguishable auditory stimuli associated with many directions within movement space. What I've shown you is movement space. That's just to say we need to be able to tell apart the sounds for each direction of movement. So if you're a blind person, something's out there, you need to be able to play some sounds. If it's going that way, if it's going that way versus that, back toward, or coming directly toward, all of these different possible directions, not all of them, but for sufficiently many of them, you need to have some auditory stimulus that can tell you the difference between which directions it's going. And it needs to be distinguishable. You have to be able to actually distinguish it, rather than some strange sounds that you can't, like two different varieties of noise, right? That's not gonna work. 2, uniformly distributed. The auditory stimuli must be approximately uniformly distributed across movement space. Said differently, we want distinct sounds across many different directions that an object might be moving relative to the listener. And we don't really want some directions to have greater resolution than others. It's just like to have, maybe we've got 20 or a certain number of directions of movement the thing could be moving. We need stimuli that can help us distinguish between all of those different uniformly distributed directions. All right, these sound kind of mathematical and lame, but they're important. Once you lay them out, sometimes you realize, oh my gosh, all of these constraints, there's so few things that could possibly satisfy them, and then you find something that does, you're like, holy crap, maybe that's not an accident. We'll get to that later. All right, number 3. The auditory stimuli, whatever it is that we pick, whatever it is, it needs to go in a loop. It goes from 0 degrees to 360 degrees. That is to say, objects can move in any direction along the ground. We're presuming here that everything is along the ground, which makes this simpler. Objects can move in any direction along the ground relative to your position. And that's just all the directions in a circle. Right, so it needs to go in a loop. Mirror. Number 4 is mirror requirement. Movement space is left-right symmetric. That is, the range from 0 to 180 degrees is mirror symmetric with the range from 0 to negative 180 degrees. Therefore, any auditory stimuli we might concoct for blind people for this space must also be left-right symmetric. So what I'm saying is that, suppose there's something out there, off to my right. Now, it can be coming toward me or going away from me, and those are not symmetric with anything else. There's only one way to come toward me. But suppose if it was coming a little bit toward me, but kind of going to pass by in front, versus a little bit the other direction, a little bit to the left of coming toward me and a little bit to the right of coming. Well, those are symmetric. They're the same thing as far as I'm concerned in terms of its direction of motion. They're coming in different parts of my body, but in regards to setting aside the direction that I'm facing, those are two symmetrical things. And so whatever the stimuli are, for a little bit, 10 degrees to the left of directly toward me and 10 degrees directly to the right of toward me, well, they need to be stimuli that wear on their sleeves that they're somehow symmetrical. They need to be, in some sense, intrinsically symmetrical auditory stimuli so it feels symmetrical to your brain. And it's going to be one kind of requirement. All right, number 5. Well, this is a weird one. It's sort of obvious when I state it, but it's going to starting to get a little bit harder to satisfy. Although I'm not even sure that it's easy to satisfy the mirror one if you haven't thought about this a lot. So, number 5 is I call size varying. Size varying. For an object very far away, well, we can just treat it as a point. And its direction of movement is characterized by a single direction in movement space. So if it's really small, like a fly, then wherever it moves, it's basically, I can just, in that, whatever part of my visual, projective field, I'm saying projective field rather than visual field because it could be behind me as well. In whatever part of my projective field it is, it's basically a point. In which case there's just one direction that fly has. And same for even big objects like a car. If it's really, really far away, it's effectively a point. But more generally though, objects get larger as they get closer. And so when an object is nearby and fills a considerable portion of your projective field, it blocks a lot of your view, not only are the different portions of the object in different positions around you, that is here and here in different places, but the different portions of the object are moving in different directions relative to you. Now, this is key. When an object is close and it's moving, the different parts of the objects have different velocities, different directions of motion relative to you. Let me just throw it up on the screen here. So here we have another ear and we've got a big object, much closer, like a car potentially passing me. Now, if you look at the front left bumper of this car that's passing me, well, it's pretty close to just about to pass, right? Whereas the other one, the back left fender of this car, is still a long way from passing. They have, and it's actually more likely to hit me. It's closer to hitting me. It's coming more directly at me than is the other. They have different directions of motion relative to me. They're different. Same object, same velocity overall, but its directions of motion of its different parts are moving differently in my projective field relative to me, right? So that in the direction space, if you go over to direction space, well, the one that's at theta 2 has a big angle, and then theta 1 is a small angle. In direction space, it's summarized by a range of angles of direction of movement, not just one, like a fly would be or a car would be when it's really far away. Objects, when they move around you and they're close, have different directions of motion relative to you. So this is just what parallax is. Parallax refers to the world like if I close my eye, just to make it simpler, and I go like this, then different things in the world shear and move more quickly or more slowly in my visual field, in my projective field. And even single objects, different parts of them are moving at different speeds depending on where they are. It's often, if they're really small, it'd be hard to tell because they're actually pretty much moving at the same speed, but they're really big, then different parts of that same object are moving at different speeds in your visual field with different directions within your visual field. And they're shearing. So when you move kind of objects, the objects shear and move differently depending on their position. So in order to have an auditory stimulus that handles the directions of movements of objects around you, I now need to have, let's say, if the thing is over there and filling up a lot of my projective field, I need to have some kind of sound over there, and then maybe sounds in the middle, and then a sound at kind of where the end of the object is. And the sound over here needs to represent, well, it's moving this way on this part of the object, let's say already passing me, is exactly transversely passing me, whereas this other part way over there is still basically coming almost directly toward me, for example. Right? And things are in between, at the in-between spots. You need to have different auditory stimuli that indicate these different kinds of directions of movement across your projective field, referring to the different parts of the object. Said another way, to characterize the movements of objects around you, you will need multiple simultaneous sounds in multiple spots around you because single objects actually move in multiple simultaneous directions relative to your position. Now, all the object's parts are obviously moving in the same direction relative to the world, namely south in that figure that I was showing. But we're interested in the movement directions relative to your position. It's all about you. We're all trying to understand how things are moving relative to me. That's why all of our perceptions are built in a egocentric perspective, never a top-down bird's eye view. All right, number 6, cohesive adjacent combinations. This sounds kind of boring. Because the stimulus cue for the direction of a nearby object must be simultaneous auditory stimuli, as we just discussed, we must choose auditory stimuli such that they can combine and be meaningfully processed as a single, sensible stimulus. On the other hand, directions that are very different from one another in that space need not easily perceptually combine at all. They can be dissonant. So that's just to say, for objects that are close, for positions in movement space that are near one another, we need those sounds so that they're both playing at the same time. Something, let's say, moving at 30 degrees relative to me and something moving at 10 degrees relative to me. Those things might combine quite often because there might be objects that are pretty close and both of those things are happening. I need it to be the case that if those stimuli, that those sounds, whatever we choose for those two different kinds of sounds, they're able to combine in such a way that I get it when they combine. That they combine into a sound combination that's sensible to the human brain. That's not easy. And I need it to be that if, let's say, moving to the left at 30 degrees, and then let's say moving away at the other side 30 degrees, these are like 180 degrees apart directions, one object won't be doing both of these things. So I don't mind if those sounds don't combine very well. They can be dissonant when they combine and aren't easy for me to process because they're not going to combine in the real world. So we want the nearby directions in the space to be able to combine because objects that are close may be having combinations of these nearby ones. Okay? And I'm going to argue that it's notes combining into chords that are exactly that. But let's get that. I have to hold off before we can get there. Number 7 out of 8 is associations. Whether objects are coming toward you, passing you, or moving away from you matters a lot in terms of their implications. Right? Objects moving toward you are more worth your attention, and they only come toward you for so long, after which they pass you. Moving away from you is comparatively stable, unless the mover chooses to turn around and come back toward you. The auditory stimuli that we choose to make this all work somehow, associated with these distinct qualitative kinds of movement directions, should instinctively connote these sorts of differences. That moving away is inherently non-alarming. For example, coming toward you should be more alarming. It's a looming stimulus. It should sound intrinsically looming, like, oh, all right, I better react, right? In real life, stimuli that's looming toward you and in other kinds of stimuli that are cues to looming is increasing intensity and a higher pitch. Let's say if it's a car, it'll have a higher pitch because it's a Doppler pitch because it's coming toward you, and it'll have a higher intensity, and it's a non-decreasing Doppler pitch because it's not passing you. So if something goes, you're not worried. As long as its pitch is falling, it's going to pass you. It means it's no longer going directly toward you. But if it just stays at the same pitch and it doesn't fall, it's a looming stimulus. You better jump out of the way. That's why we're willing to let cars go by us at 1 meter without even looking, because we can hear the Doppler pitches fall. Not worried about it. But as soon as its pitch stays the same, you might jump out of the way before getting hit. That's another kind of stimulus. This is a different kind of stimulus that we're talking about here. Finally, number 8 on these 8 criteria, meaningful sequential combinations. So we already talked about how nearby directions of motion in this space, and they might be at different spots in my projective field, they need to be able to combine as sounds so my brain can make sense of them. Well, if I have, let's say, 2 or 3 of these things combined here because it's right here and its different parts are moving in these directions and making some kind of combination sound, well, in the next moment the entire object might move over here and then it's moving over there. Well, whatever this sound is, sequentially is followed by this sound, which is sequentially followed by this sound. Those combinations, those sequential combinations of sounds needs to be interpretable to us. It can't be gobbledygook. It can't be like fractal sounds or just weird, fax machine kinds of sounds, something like this that we can't make sense of. It needs to be interpretable by us and something that we can actually make sense of. All right, those sound like difficult things to satisfy. But if you're blind and you want to put, let's say, some band or some kind of helmet around you that can play sounds in various directions, depending on where things are, and then place different sounds, once they're closed, different sounds that also tell you not just that they're there, but the directions that they're moving, they have to satisfy all these or it won't work. It won't work otherwise. All right, so here's my radical claim coming out of this sort of history of working on the origins of music as harnessing the sounds of humans moving around us is that I claim that the regular old 7-note diatonic scale that you all know, that is, just C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, right? That this regular old scale happens to have exactly the peculiar structure and properties needed to serve as the auditory stimuli for movement space for the blind. In particular, the notes in the diatonic scale are used to point to 7 directions of movement relative to all, in terms of that space of possible movement directions. But rather than having adjacent directions using adjacent notes in the scale, adjacent directions use notes separated by a third in music. All right? So for example, in the key of C, and we're going to talk about the key of C the entire time, in the key of C major, counterclockwise after the note C comes E rather than D. So that is the nearest thing to a C, as far as we're concerned when we're going to be talking about, is not going to be D, it's going to be E or A. That's a third away from C as well. But if you're going clockwise in a space, we're going to go from C to E, and then from E to G, and then from G to B, then from B you jump C to D, and then to F, and then you're at A, and then you're back at C again. So we have the space that looks like this. There's 2 kinds of arguments that I could make. The way that I usually work as a scientist is I'm trying to show the origins of music itself rest upon evolutionary grounds, things that attach to the world in some way. They're meaningful in the world, and this is why we evolved to comprehend them and to process them. And so then music, let's say, harnesses that. I'm not going to make that kind of argument today, and I haven't really fully worked out that argument, if there is one. I'm only going to try to show you that, as it turns out, the diatonic scale, and using the diatonic scale and placing them by thirds around this space, happens to have all of the properties, happens to satisfy all the properties that we just walked through, those 8 properties. So again, this is the space. The claim is that each of these directions, C will say that, okay, the object is moving in one particular. I'm going to say later that C approximately means moving away. It's a little bit more complicated. I'll get to that in a minute. Each of these is going to be some different directions, one of 7 different directions that an object could be moving relative to my position. All right, so how could this work? Does this satisfy the 8 criteria that we mentioned? And as I walk through, I'm going to show you that, in fact, each criterion is satisfied by virtue of other properties that we already know about the diatonic scale, and keys, and chords, and chord structures, and chord progressions. Right. So, now, I just thinking to myself, you might say, what? Like, why are you not putting C next to D? And why are you putting C next to E? Why are they like skipping things? Well, one motivation, sort of intuitive motivation for why one would even do this is that C and D are dissonant. If you play C and D, you play any note on the diatonic scale and you play the note directly next to it, they're highly dissonant. Whereas when you jump a third, they're actually very close in a perceptual consonant sense. So you don't want to have C next to D because D is very dissonant. It means that it's something that's very unlike C. All right, so that's one kind of motivation. It's not a complete explanation, but it's kind of one motivation for why you don't want to have C, D, them just listed in alphabetical order. So now this sounds suspiciously oversimple. How can a mere 7 notes strewn about in thirds around the circle possibly satisfy all constraints that we just discussed? So let's walk through them one by one. Okay, the first, recall, was distinguishable. And each note in the 7-note scale is distinguishable from every other. I mean, that's easy. I mean, once we know that we're in the key of C because you've heard, let's say, a couple notes being played, your brain gets that you're in the key of C, well, all the notes are distinguishable. Okay. 2, uniformly distributed. Yeah, the notes in the diatonic scale are indeed uniformly distributed across movement space. That is just the figure 3. They're just distributed across movement space. Loop. Yeah, the diatonic scale is inherently that of a loop, and having them ordered from third to third and skipping the notes in between still makes a loop. It just happens to go over 2 octaves before getting back to the start. Okay. Mirror. The circle of thirds that we saw before has the needed mirror symmetry, although it's not often appreciated that this is the case. To see that there's a mirror symmetry within it, in this diagram, I've placed the words major and minor between each interval in the figure below, in this particular figure. Major means that there are 4 semitones, the smallest steps from note to note on a piano is called a semitone, and that's using the full 12 tone scale. So a major means there's 4 semitones separating the 2 notes, and a minor means there's only 3 semitones separating the notes. So, for example, when you go from C to E on a piano, it goes C, C sharp, D, D sharp, and then to E. So you've gone through what's called a major interval, or a major third, or 4 steps in terms of all the little black and white notes on the piano. But when you go from E to G, it goes from E to F, F sharp, and then to G. It only goes through 3 steps. It's a minor third interval. So when you look at this minor and major intervals shown throughout here, you start to see that, okay, well, if you look for symmetries here, you can actually see that, well, look at the line that cuts across from D. D, if you look to the left and the right of it, they're both minor, and then it's major, major across its line, and then it's minor, minor, and then major at the end between E and C. And if you poke around, you'll find there's no other axis that you can draw, no other line or mirror that you can draw such that all the major and minors are always opposite to each other. That is, they're both majors across that mirror. That's the only place that happens. So D is in fact, the line across D is where there's a left-right symmetry. So it does have the left-right mirror properties that we're looking for. So what I've done now is I've just redrawn the space, but I put D pointing directly down so that you can see more of the left-right symmetry. It stands out more strongly. So in terms of the diatonic scale, this symmetry, most people don't really think about, and I didn't really think about this symmetry. I don't think I ever thought about this symmetry. The symmetry is due to the unique position of D within the diatonic scale of C major. It's the only note for whom looking to the left looks like looking to the right on the keyboard. So said differently, consider C on the piano shown in the upper portion of this figure below. The lower image below it shows that same image except that it's been flipped horizontally. Now the C note is actually the E in this reflection. Similarly, G and A are mirrors of one another, as are B and F. You can see that these mirrors are on opposite sides of the diagram in our earlier circle. Because of this axis of symmetry, the D direction must either be directly toward the listener or away. That is, D in this diagram, because that's the axis of symmetry. There's the axis of symmetry in terms of the movement directions in space that you have to somehow provide auditory stimuli for the blind person here. It's coming directly toward you and directly away. That is this axis of symmetry. Then you've got the left and right versions of which there's 2 copies of everything, right? So whatever D is, it's either toward me or away. And I'm going to argue later that I think it's probably means more naturally to the brain that it's coming toward you for a variety of reasons. Okay. So it satisfies this space, this circle of thirds, just skipping C, E, G, and so on around over 2 octaves, has the mirror properties as well. All right, number 5. Size varying, remember? So for a faraway object, again, it becomes a point, and the entire object has the same direction in one's visual field. And so in that case, a single note in this auditory space suffices for summarizing that object's direction of motion. It's really far away, or it's a fly, really up close. One part of your projective field, and then you need just whatever sound it is in that space. Let's suppose it's an F, because the fly is moving in that particular direction, the one depicted by F in this space. But when objects are close, and not the size of a fly, there are different portions in your projective field have different directions of motion relative to you, as we discussed. And so more than one of these notes must be played simultaneously to represent the object's direction of motion in totality relative to you. So for example, let's look at the object in figure 7 below. It has an interval of movement directions shown in the second part of this diagram. So we had seen this earlier, theta 1 and theta 2, and it has this interval that we saw already below. So what we would do here is that if we're treating D as moving toward you, we're going to just call D moving toward you. Well, then this is approximately where you would play B and D. B meaning kind of coming toward you, but it's sort of moving 30 degrees, 25 degrees off to the left. Whereas D means coming more directly toward you. Now, in this case, it's not coming directly toward you, but it's more approximately toward. So roughly a D and a B here would encapsulate the kind of movement that this thing is currently undergoing. And you have to put it in the part of your projective field, depending on where it is. It could be but once you figured out where it is, those are the notes you play. You play B and D. All right? Now, here's another example. Here's a differently shaped object. It's now sort of an oval. It's passing the listener, but because the object is nearby, its direction of motion relative to the listener is not a single value, again. Instead, the front of the object is already considerably passed by the listener and has a direction of movement close to 135 degrees. The tail, however, of the object is still approaching and hasn't yet passed by. Its angle of direction of movement is close to 45 degrees. These directions are shown in the next figure in the middle, and you can see it's that range. It's that range of directions on the left that this particular object is in total encompassing, right? It's got all of these direction of movements in it. So on the right, you can then pick 3 notes on the left side of this diagram that approximately encapsulate the full directionality relative to you of this nearby object. In this case, you would be playing E, G, and B. G is sort of somewhere in the middle, and then the B and the E are more at the front and at the tail end. And finally here, this other figure is just another case. It's already past you, it's moving away. Now the ranges of directions of motion of it are more at the upper left side of the space, and so we could pick something like E and G to summarize the directions of motion it's going. And again, place them in the part of your projective field where the thing actually is in those directions. So we can handle the size varying by putting adjacent pairs of these things together. So it satisfies size varying. All right, now number 6, cohesive adjacent combinations. The issue here is if these notes, each coding for a distinct direction of movement, are played simultaneously, is the resultant sound something that our brain can make sense of? right? If I play, what we had before, if I played this most recent one, which is playing an E and a G, does that make sense to our brain? And the one before that, we had an E and a G and a B together all at the same time. Is that something sensible and something that our brain can make sense of? Well, yes. Adjacent combinations of these notes give us exactly the ranges of chords used in music. Right? First, combining any two adjacent notes in the space just leads to two-note pairs. In such notes, as they're separated by a third, always sound consonant, as if it's due to one thing in the world. Each of the 7 pairs are shown in gray in this new figure, and each is placed in the direction at the center between the 2 individual directions. However, remember that that's not the direction of the object a 2-note pair describes. Rather, a 2-note pair concerns a single, relatively nearby object describing the range of directions of movement it possesses. So you can see now CE is directly away, describing something that's reasonably close and moving directly away. Then you've got AC and then FA. All of these things are sensible to your brain. Music is filled with these 2-note pairs all the time. They're not quite chords yet, but they're not single notes. Now consider when an object is even closer, and 3 notes must be used to describe its direction of movement. Now we have combinations of 3 of these adjacent note directions. And these are simply the standard 7 chords in the diatonic scale, shown below, placed again at the center point of the 3 directions. So we have the C major chord, which is the combination of C, E, and G, and then we have A minor, which is A, C, and E, and so on. And B not here, B0 refers to B diminished, which is B, D, and F. This circle is actually what is traditionally called the circle of thirds, where you're looking at the chords as you move across from third to third, moving chords up or down by a third. This is the circle of thirds, but the circle of thirds, now the motivation for the circle of thirds is one that's based on tracking or stimuli that help you make sense of or process the directions of movements of objects in the world, of objects that fill a lot of your projective field and thus have multiple directions of movement when they move. And anybody that's blind that wants to have that perception needs those to combine to mean something together at the same time. And chords are exactly that. Where you never thought of yourself as understanding or processing chords, but all day long when you listen to music, you're bombarded with chords, and when you hear a chord, it sounds like one thing. And then they play another chord, it means something different to your brain. You're not necessarily consciously aware of what it means, but you can process it, you can distinguish it, you make sense of it as a unified thing. Now, let's continue this onward. If we were instead to combine 4 adjacent notes, so suppose it's even closer, so much that it's filling 4 of these different directions out of the 7. So it's almost filling up half of my projective field. It's really close. Well, I have even a more widely diverse bunch of movement directions. Now it's going to fill 7. So we get it. Now we're going to be combining 4 of these across, and we get something that we get the chords that are called the 7s. So this is like A minor 7, F major 7, D minor 7. As we go around the circle, these are all the 7s. Where, what is an A minor 7? Well, it just tells you. It's where you're playing a G. You go to the beginning of this dotted line, G, well, doing it the right way. It would be an A, and then a C, and then an E, and then a G. That's what an A minor 7 is. So again, even combining 4 of these for really close objects is a sensible thing. Songs are, regular chords with 3 notes. This is in some sense the bread and butter, but 7s happen all the time. Music is filled with 7s all the time. It's extremely sensible to your brain. Now you get beyond that, and it's still other greater possibilities. So for example, in the same way you can get the 9s where you combine 5 of these, and now it shouldn't happen that often, because now you have objects that are filling more than half of your projective field, or would have to be, because in order to have the directions of movement that are going more than half of those, movement space where things are moving, more than 180 degrees worth in that way, probably the thing might be having to wrap around you more than 180 degrees. There might be some weird counterexamples like that, where maybe it's a really concave shape or something. Anyway, these should happen more rarely, I think, but they're still sensible chords. We have things in music, and they sound and they mean something very different. And I suggest what they mean is that it is in fact very close to you. It's more enveloping. And when you play these chords, you get into sort of dissonant parts of it, where you feel as if there's opposite directions going on at the same time of yet the same object, Now what I've done here in this way, you can show the individual notes in blue at the center, pairs by these red ones moving out to the regular chords in black, to the sevens in gray, to the nines, and again, always the center of their position that they refer to in terms of movement space. The nines, and then the 11s are all positioned accordingly. And as far as I know, this is the first time that in some sense, all the chords, all the standard adjacent chords, because of course there's other kinds of chords where you just sort of have one bass, and there's millions of varieties of other combinations, but the standard zoology of chords that happens in a typical diatonic scale is right in front of you now, all placed in an appropriate systematized fashion in this space. All right, so going back to the requirement, the mirror requirement, we can now see that C major and A minor chords are mirrors of one another. That is, remember, the left and right side of this, where D was this vertical line, was the axis of symmetry, well now B diminished is also on this axis of symmetry. And you can see that C and A minor are across from each other. And this makes sense. The C major scale, when we say the C major scale, we just mean the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, all the white keys on the piano. But the A minor scale is the same exact notes. And the way that we know that it's A minor scale versus C is kind of tricky. It really depends on the way you resolve at the end of the chord progressions. But in some sense, it's really the same thing. It's just sort of different ways in which you move around the space. So both A minor, this is really both an A minor and a C key simultaneous. So it better be the case that C and A minor are symmetrical. In some sense, they're totally symmetrical in the space. They're just the opposite sides of this D, this special position that D is in. A minor just looks like a C if you were to take a photo of it and then flip it over. Same for F and E minor and D minor and G. B diminished, however, is not symmetrical with anybody else. Just to catch our tail a little bit. So what we've seen is that we can just use the regular old diatonic scale, but skipping by thirds. And my gosh, we can start to actually use it as a way to represent the directions of movements of things in the world. And when things are close by, those big things have multiple directions of movement, despite being one thing. They have multiple directions of movements relative to you. They're moving in multiple directions. And you can hear all of those directions at the same simultaneous time in different parts of your projected field by using these notes separated by thirds, and your brain does, in fact, combine them to meaningful things because we're good at processing those things because they're just chords. They are just chords. Okay. All right, number 7, associations. Do these chords have any associations, that is metaphorical, other associations that they happen to have with other aspects of our mental life? Do they have associations that suggest they might actually be interpreted by the brain as directions of movement relative to me? Is there something about these things that suggest they have anything to do with movement at all? Now, this may require another book-length study to flesh out, a follow-up to my earlier book, Harnessed, but there are some hints of this. For one thing, it's well known that certain chords have a strong desire to move to some chords, but not to other chords. So at the highest level, chords in C major have a tendency to go from C to F to G and back to C again. That's sort of the simplest chord progression you can imagine. This is often called the tonic, which is C, and to a subdominant, F is sort of the paradigm example, and to a dominant G, and then back to a tonic C again. But more generally, the tonics are C and A minor, and they're deemed very stable. They're not asking for anything per se to happen next. That is, when you play an A minor or you play a C, the intuitions people have developed is that it doesn't ask much to happen yet. It's just sort of sitting there. It's very stable. So this is consistent with them cueing or meaning to your brain that it's moving kind of away from you. That's a very stable thing, because when things move away, well, they just keep moving away. Whereas things come toward you, that's temporary, because things can only come toward you for so long, because you're at a particular spot. It's going to pass you, going through other kinds of sounds, and then eventually move away, in which case it's stable again. Subdominance, sort of the second part of this sort of intuition that chord progressions move from tonic to subdominant to dominant back to tonic again. Subdominants refer to F, the chord F, as well as D minor. And it's often says that when you play a subdominant, You're beginning to ask a question, as this intuition people often say. Something has begun to happen, and it's sort of inherently transient. This is consistent with the mover having turned from moving away and is sort of coming back. It's in a transverse direction, perhaps on its way to being more directly toward you. I mean, it may turn again, but something is beginning to happen. It's not just the total stability of moving away. Whereas dominants tend to come after subdominants in the standard lore and refer to G and B diminished. And the idea behind them is that they're dramatic and there's lots of tension and they can't last for too long. And this is consistent, this sort of general intuition and feel about those chords is that it's consistent with objects moving toward you, where eventually, and not too long, it's going to pass you or to hit you, right? At which time it very rapidly goes back to the tonic again because it starts to, it's just moving away from you after a short period of time. And the dominant B diminished, or that B not, if you recheck the earlier diagram with major and minor intervals between them, between each note, it consists of two minor intervals on either side, rather than one major and one minor interval as all the other chords. Every other separation between the note and the two things was either a major and a minor in terms of the individual notes, or a minor and a major, but D was the only one that was buffered on both sides by only two minors. Minor intervals are more distant than major intervals in some sense, and the combination of having two minor intervals somewhat sounds dissonant. And this tends to make it sound more alarming, more looming, more like a train. A lot of these trains seem to be selected over time to be a little bit dissonant in this sense and sounding more like a B diminished. And the last one of these 8 was meaningful sequential combination. So how does this idea that at any given moment an object potentially close by is a chord itself that represents, it's a chord with its notes played at different positions in my projected field, but that chord is summarizing the directions of movements of the object, because yeah, sure, I know it's here, but is it moving like this, or is it moving like that, or which way is it moving? The different chord will tell you, right? And if it's really far away, it'll just be one note. If it's in between, it'll be two notes, etc. I want to know though, how do those, if I'm playing a chord now and it moves over here, does it make sense to my brain when I hear one chord and then later another chord? Is this something that we can make sense of? So let's just read it as I wrote it in the LooFWIRED magazine. Not only do simultaneous combinations of the note directions sound meaningful, that is, they sound like chords, and cohesive, and not only might they have many associations with movement that I just hinted at, but the sequential combination of these chords are meaningful. Most music is built on the backbone of these. They're simply called chord progressions. That's just to say, there's no worry about whether people can reliably process and distinguish complex sequences of these stimuli. Music is built out of. This is bread and butter, basic music. It's built out of sequences of these chords. Your brain loves and understands and can make sense of these sequences of chords. And it sounds like one thing. It's a story of one thing changing over time, not just another thing and another thing and some kind of chaos. No, it's one thing changing over time. Let me provide you an example. Let's suppose there's some object in the world. This little triangle is the blind person pointing in a particular direction. You imagine that they have a helmet or a headband around their head. And so the question is, what notes do you play? There's some object in the world. It senses that the object senses that the thing is moving, roughly in that direction of the arrow over there. So the question is, what at this particular moment, what notes should be played at those 3 different positions on the helmet or on the headband to indicate the parallax and the total movement directions relative to the listener of this particular object. So what you would do is just, from an objective scientific perspective in terms of the algorithms of the machine, it figures out the listener's position and the direction she's facing. That's the black triangle, and you take the listener's frame of reference. You take her frame of reference, and you act as if the mover's stationary, and then you figure out where the object's extent is, its projected field, which is out there on the right. And once you do that, you put a copy of that same vector near the listener such that its vector tip touches the listener. It's just the same overall direction of motion and sort of in the environment. And place all the other notes, and then once you've done that, that's the direction that it's moving, that's D, and place all the other notes accordingly around the circle of thirds, given where D now is. And whenever a note's direction runs into where the object is in the world, we show the note on the object and make the note bold. The combination of those bold notes is just put within the object itself. In this case, it was the chord G. So the device, upon sensing an object like this moving as shown by that arrow, given the direction of the direction that the person is facing, would just play a G chord, and namely would play a G, B, and a D at those particular positions on the headband to indicate exactly where the different parts are. Right? Now, that was all a general case where you're trying to perceive the movements of things that are potentially moving around you. But there's a really specific case where we're not worried or interested in objects that are moving. We're only interested in self-motion. So something that blind people really need to care about, even a special case of all that we've discussed, is just where they're moving and everything in the world is stationary. Of course, some things in the world are going to move, but a lot of their time is moving all around things, and they just need to navigate stationary objects. And the mover that really matters is themselves. Okay? Is themselves. So thus far, the idea of using chords to cue a blind person about direction of movement was being applied to the movement of other objects, but probably the most important application of this idea concerns perception of one's own self-motion among stationary objects, i.e. just navigating the environment and any obstacles. Unlike objects that are moving, stationary objects tend to make no sound at all, and blind people would be most aided by being able to hear their silent position and movement directions relative to them. When you're moving forward, everything in the environment moves with the opposite of your velocity relative to you. First and foremost, because the motion here is just self-motion, the circle of thirds gets a fixed orientation relative to your direction of motion. That is to say, now each note is not only indicating a direction of movement, but is also indicating a specific spot in your projective field. That is, if you look at this diagram, if I'm always moving forward, and the things that are always moving are just things that are moving relative to me, that is, they're stationary objects, and they're only moving because I'm moving, that is, they're just getting closer to me, or farther if they're directly behind me, then things that are moving toward me are always things that are directly in front, because everything that's moving, that is, things that are directly in front are moving directly toward me. Things that are over there are moving always transversely and so forth. So now, rather than something being over here and it could be moving toward me or away, no. Now it's exactly mathematically tied. Whenever it's in a particular spot, it's also moving with a particular direction relative to me, in fact, like this. So now we just imagine this headband, it's only, as far as we're concerned here, it only needs to play D in front, and B over here, and G over here, and E back here, and it doesn't even have the ability to make any other sound, and it wouldn't matter because it's never going to play except over in this particular spot. And it's only going to do so when there's something that's moving, namely, it's not moving, I'm moving relative, but it's something that's approaching at those particular positions in my visual field. So for this use case, each note tells you where, because once you hear the note, it'll tell you, okay, if it's D, I know it's directly in front. I don't even have to even put it at the front of the thing. If I just have it, even one speaker here, you hear D, you'll just learn, oh, it always means directly in front and moving directly toward me, because that's what happens when the objects are directly in front of me when I'm moving, right? So for this use case, each note tells you where and which movement direction that part of the visual space or the projective space is moving. These were dissociated for the perception of other movers. A device able to accommodate the movement of objects needed to be able to play any of the 7 notes in any part of your projective field, but a device able to accommodate self-motion needs to only have a dedicated D sound at the front of your head via hat or helmet, a dedicated B sound to the front right, and so on. Each note will only activate if there's some object or part of an object in the environment in that direction. The note's loudness will be according to its distance. I'm assuming here that the mover's head is always facing in the direction of motion, which of course won't always be the case. So, objects in the environment will be heard as chords. So once you start moving, groups of notes that are adjacent, as you start moving, objects, a single object that's moving in a particular way will be heard as a chord. The larger the chord, the closer it is. Right? Larger or nearer objects will be heard as larger chords. The chords will tend to progress from D, if it's going on one side, it doesn't really matter which is left, but supposing on the right side, it'll go from D all the way down to an E if it's going on the right side, or start from a D going all the way back to C on the left side. Choice of which side is arbitrary. The chords will tend to begin as small. They'll tend to be far away, small, just a single D, but as it gets closer, it might become a D and a B, or a D and a B and an F. It'll expand to get closer, and then maybe it turns out that's actually going to pass me by, or I veer around it to one side, in which case it then, let's say, becomes a F chord, and then an A minor chord, and then moves back around the back, and then to a C chord, but then it gets smaller and smaller, just C and E, and then maybe just C all by itself. This is the note C all by itself. But I have a particular stereotyped pattern in terms of the progression of these chords as you move throughout the environment. And there might well be multiple objects in your projective field, in which case there might be two simultaneously played chords from disparate parts of the circle. And that should sound dissonant, because you have one chord that's way over here that does bind together, and some other chord way over here which binds together, but together they don't bind together because they're dissonant. They're far in the auditory space as well. It should hopefully sound like two chords and two things. So in this case, we have a person moving forward. There's that object shown. It would be played as the chord, or the pair of G and B. A fraction of a second later, maybe that object on the right has moved farther past, in which case now it's an E minor, because it's an E, G, and a B in this space. And something new, just an F, far small enough that it's just a single note, so you have an F on the other far side. And it'll look like two objects of these varying sizes, and so on. If you're walking straight, the chord progressions for the stationary objects in the environment will tend to be along one of the two sides of this space. When far away, those progressions will tend to look like, it'll start off as D, and then it'll go B, G, E, and then that's the end, or it'll go D, F, A, C in a way. But if it's getting fairly close to you, it'll be like, it'll start as D, and then maybe become D and B, B, G, B, G, E, which is an E minor, G, E, and then E. And instead, if it's going the other side, it'll be D, and then a D and an F, and then an F and an A, and then FAC, which is a chord F, and then AC, and then C, and then way. And there's multiple ways that this could go, depending on how if you're actually slightly veering and not just moving totally straight. So you may well indeed move in interesting trajectories, turning in order to encounter some new object, passing it, turning again for another pass, and so on. The result would be repeated loops in this space, chord progressions that go around the circle of thirds, not just sort of starting on one side and ending on the other side. What appeared to be a suspiciously simple idea for cueing movement directions of objects, that is, just use the circle of thirds with the activation of the note D, meaning toward me, turns out to be very powerful. It has the key properties needed to work to cue the movement of objects, including that they have parallax, cued by combinations of adjacent notes in the circle of thirds, which includes chords, with which our brains are totally familiar, and that a moving object courses through multiple such states during its path, cued by sequences of chords, or chord progressions, something with which our brains are also very familiar. This is just to say chords and chord progressions. The basic backbone of music as we all know it serves to indicate the parallax-filled movements of objects in our midst. And, as the most important special case, serves to help blind people see the silent, stationary objects in their environment. All right, so just go get yourself, find it, LooFWIRED.com, so you can really peruse it more carefully, these kinds of images. If you're interested, if you have friends that are interested, engineers that are interested in working with me to make this reality, I'd love it. I'd love to be able to see evolutionarily inspired ideas that can really help blind people see, that are based upon all the kinds of principles that you need to really help them, rather than these really kind of top-down, non-embedded, non-evolutionary, non-ecological, we say, ideas, which are the kinds that just an engineer would typically come up with, but they're not the kind of thing that evolution does. And if you're interested in my earlier book, Harnessed, How Language and Music Mimic Nature and Transformed Ape to Man, this is highly tied to this topic here, and I'm hoping that the next step research-wise here is to see whether chords have all of these properties that can be used to track objects moving around you whether it's just an accident. And I doubt that this is an accident. I think that there's something about the cultural evolution of music and chords and chord progressions that has evolved, culturally evolved in that way, so that it can harness our natural ability to understand these stimuli as moving objects, nearby moving objects around you. And that when you're listening to music all the time, these chords are in fact part of the story. And in addition to everything I talk about in harness, they're also viscerally adding the movements of nearby objects around you, and you can feel how they move because of these chord structures and chord progressions as the music persists. And that was your science moment.